May I now begin with my welcome? Okay. So, on behalf of the Indian Economic Review, the in-house journal of the Department of Economics, Delhi School of Economics, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our speaker, Professor Melissa Dell, and to everyone here today. As many in the audience here are perhaps aware, the Delhi School of Economics was set up in 1949 as an institution for advanced studies and research in economics. 3 years later, in 1952, the school's journal, the Indian Economic Review, began publication thanks to the initiative of V.K.R.B. Rao, one of the school's founders. For a country that had achieved independence after nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule barely 5 years earlier, the journal was to play an important role in shaping the thinking around economic and social development policies. Over the decades, the journal has been served by illustrious editors who have also played important roles in public life. The founding editor, Professor Rao, was Union Minister for Education in the 1970s. Manmohan Singh went on to serve as the country's Prime Minister. Suresh Tendulkar was a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Most recently, Pami Dua has served as a member of the country's apex monetary policy decision-making body. The journal was also privileged to have the eminent economic historian Dharma Kumar serve as editor-in-chief. In fact, it may interest Professor Dell to know that the Delhi School used to be home to many influential economic historians, including Tapan Ray Chaudhary, Om Prakash, Sanjay Subramaniam, G. Balachandran, just to name a few. The Delhi School has been host to several distinguished international economists, including some who later became Nobel laureates. The journal has privileged to feature some of their work, and last year, we published a special volume reprinting their papers among that of others. IER's canvas is broad and has featured articles ranging from the development planning to modern development economics, from structuralist to monetarist perspective on macroeconomics, from general equilibrium social choice to agency theory, from international trade to agrarian structure, and a range of other topics. We have a revamped and international editorial board and have recently launched a very successful policy review section as an attempt to bridge the policy and economic discourse spaces. Some of these have seen downloads in the several tens of thousands. The IER used to host an annual lecture, a practice that was discontinued. We are delighted to be able to restart that tradition with today's talk and to host, albeit virtually, Professor Melissa Dell, whose research on institutions and mechanisms through which they influence development and the theoretical and empirical rigor that lends it such depth all resonate for economists in a country like India. We are also very pleased that a member of our editorial board, Professor Kaushik Basu, has consented to chair this session. A former faculty of the Delhi School, Professor Basu has himself played an important role in the journal's development. He is, of course, now at Cornell University. Before I turn it over to Professor Basu to introduce the speaker, some logistics. Given the large size of the audience, we will be able to entertain questions only via the chat box. In order to minimize distractions, we will enable the chat box approximately 45 minutes into the talk. I will then collate these questions and put them to the speaker after our talk. The event is also being live streamed on YouTube. Over to you, Professor Basu.
Thank you very much, Uday. It is a great pleasure to chair this year's Indian Economic Review lecture by Melissa Dell, Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Let me begin by first congratulating the Delhi School of Economics and Indian Economic Review for organizing this. And Uday Bhanu Sinha deserves very special credit for reviving this great lecture tradition and also for injecting fresh energy into the Indian Economic Review. I know there are many other players involved in this revival. Congratulations to them. This was a journal, as Uday Bhanu just mentioned, that was started by V.K.R.V. Rao in 1952, soon after the founding of the Delhi School of Economics itself in 1949. Over the years, the journal has published several extremely important papers and contributed in a big way to economic thought in India and actually for emerging economies in general. I've been very happy to see the enthusiasm with which Uday has taken his charge as editor-in-chief of Indian Economic Review with zest and energy. I feel good about the lecture also because the special place that Delhi School of Economics has in my heart. The Delhi School is one of the most important academic associations of my own academic career. This is the first job I took up after completing my PhD in London and spent 17 years teaching and doing research and also wasting a lot of time in the coffee house. That was a part of the Delhi School life. When you look back at the history of the Delhi School of Economics, Uday Bhanu just gave us a glimpse of it. It is quite stunning. Its contribution to modern India. Among its faculty and students, we have had one future prime minister, Nobel laureate, several of the most prominent thinkers, policymakers, ministers who have shaped modern India and given India the kind of place it has in the world of ideas and science. I hope it will continue to play that pivotal pioneer role in the world of free thinking and new ideas. Really, India stands out in terms of the interface between the world of policymaking and the world of ideas, and institutions like the Delhi School of Economics have played a very major role. It is a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Melissa Dell. I've never met Melissa before. Melissa is one of the most creative economists in the world, and she has reached that status at a very young age. She grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, did her studies at Harvard University. I read somewhere, I don't know if it is true, that she was the first student from her school who went to Harvard. She went to Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, and MIT, where she did her PhD with Daron Acemoglu. Thereafter, she was a junior member of the Harvard Society of Fellows from 2012 to 2014, and in recent times, as I just mentioned, she has been professor at Harvard. Melissa Dell has won virtually every honor one can win at such a young age, including the John Bates Clark Medal in the year 2020. She is a prolific researcher who works in the field of development economics, political economy, and history. Her work is breathtaking in ambition. She takes on questions most people hesitate to ask, let alone invest huge amounts of time and intellectual focus trying to investigate. How a nation grows and develops depends, of course, on the things that we economists look at all the time: fiscal and monetary policy details, micro interventions, such as in schooling and healthcare and different kinds of investment. But we are also aware, often subliminally, that a country's path of development depends on institutions, on big political decisions, on the history of war and revolutions. These are questions that historians ask, but these are questions for which it's very difficult to give full detailed answer. Melissa Dell asks these questions and then takes some of the most sophisticated methods of economic analysis, including statistical techniques, to answer these very big questions and to locate some of the causal drivers behind the trajectory of nations. Economics is today at a very exciting moment. Just as the Industrial Revolution had caused big changes to humankind from roughly 1750 to 1850, we are today facing big challenges once again. because of many things, the digital revolution, big breakthroughs in information technology and artificial intelligence. And in the midst of all this, the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown a spanner into the machinery of the global economy. And most of you are, I'm sure, confined at home listening to this lecture and acutely aware. One reason we came out of the Industrial Revolution eventually a winner, with the world growing much faster than it did before the start of the Industrial Revolution, is because economics made some of its most major discoveries during this time. This period of the Industrial Revolution coincided with some of the biggest breakthroughs in economics, from Adam Smith's seminal work, 1776, to John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy in 1848. We learned how to look at the world during this period, the world, the economy. We are once again at a juncture where the world is changing so rapidly that we need major breakthroughs in economics to keep up with it. This is a time when we need to give special attention to the connection between politics and economics. This can be a very exciting time for students of economics and political economy to try to understand what ails our world and how we can correct the problems. I hope the students and even the professors who will listen to this lecture by Melissa Dell will be able to take away the inspiration to take on some of the big questions in their own research career and investigate them. With that, let me just welcome Melissa to deliver this lecture. We shall have the opportunity for question and answer at the end, as Uday Bhanu just mentioned. Melissa, the floor is yours, or the Zoom camera is yours. I don't know how to say these things these days, so it's yours.
Thanks very much for that inspiring introduction. Thanks to the organizers, and thank you everyone who is here today, who's taking time out of what has been a very hectic and difficult time to learn a little bit more about what I'm going to be talking about. So I will pull up my slides. Hopefully the technology will work. All right, so I'm going to be talking today about a broad topic, which is the role for persistence as well as transformation in economic development. And so over the past 15 years or so, research on the persistent determinants of economic development has transformed economic history. And more generally, it has helped to inspire the integration of modern empirical methods with the study of historical data, but it's also had an influence on economics more generally. And I think in particular, it has contributed to the expansion of economics beyond its traditionally US and European focused roots. Insights from this literature have the potential as well to inform economic policy today by clarifying how policy interacts with the broader historical and institutional context, and how the effects of these policies unfold over time. And so I think in thinking about this literature, I draw inspiration from one of the greats of economics, Bob Solow, who says in this quote here, "The part of economics that is independent of history and social context is not only small, but dull." Of course, none of us want our research to be boring. And so, regardless of what you study, what your field is, bringing in some of that history and social context can really enrich the insights that come out of it. And so in particular, I want to talk today about insights that have been developed over the past decade. And I'm going to do that using illustrations from my own research. There's a huge literature and enriched literature on persistence and transformation and development. Since I know my own work best, that's what I'm going to be focusing on. But in addition to kind of looking at some of the things that we've learned, I also want to look forward and think a bit about promising future research directions. And so before I kind of launch into more details and talking about my own work, I want to give some broader intellectual history for how we think about persistence and economic development in the context of the broader discipline of economics. And so if you go back to the 1940s and 1950s, development economics was a very central part of the broader field of economics. And writings that were in this genre tended to be very rich in institutional detail, rich in historical knowledge, but they were not typically disciplined by formal theory or by data. Of course, before we had modern computing, you'd have to sit there and invert your matrix by hand if you wanted to run a regression. And so that just really hadn't entered the field of scientific analysis yet. And then during the 1950s, there was this major shift in economics. And by the time you get to the 1960s, economics journals would rarely publish things that were not disciplined by a mathematical model. And as a result, fields like economic history and development economics tend to move largely outside the mainstream because, of course, intuitively speaking, if you have, the type of mathematical models that economists had in the 1960s, it's really hard to describe the process of something like economic development, making assumptions that there's perfect information, perfect competition. It just doesn't fit with the facts. Most mathematical models of economic growth had a single long-run steady state, and history was irrelevant in those models. You always end up in the same place, kind of regardless of the previous path. Development practitioners, following the seminal work by Solow, tended to emphasize accumulating physical capital. Later, they brought in human capital, but there was less of an emphasis on the institutional context, on the social context, and the role that potentially had to play in economic development. Of course, there continued to be economic history, but by and large, it was largely focused on the historical ascendancy of Europe and to an extent the United States. Why did the Industrial Revolution happen when it did, where it did in England? There was much less of a focus on the economic history of the rest of the world. And so along with the resurgence of development economics in the 1990s and 2000s, led by people like Michael Kramer, Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, there also came a growing interest in the role that history specifically played in economic development. And so I like to think of this as a little bit analogous to an analogy that Paul Krugman made in kind of explaining what happened to development economics. Why did it die for a while, essentially within academic economics, and then come back? And he uses an African maps analogy. And so this is kind of drawn from one of his papers. And here you see this map of sub-Saharan Africa that was made by Europeans in 1554. And you can see it's very rich and full of detail, but the things that are on it are absurd. There's monsters in some places. It's just completely wrong. They had a very rich map, but it wasn't disciplined by kind of any empirical sort of understanding of what these places actually were like. And eventually they came to realize that they actually didn't know much at all. And so this is a map from 1805. You can see they just leave it blank. They're acknowledging, the limits of their knowledge. And then slowly over time, as Europeans became more familiar with sub-Saharan Africa, they started to fill in more, details. And you see some geographic details on this that are actually accurate to what's there. And so in some ways, we can think of kind of the journey of development economics as a little bit similar. People in the 40s and 50s had these very, very rich theories of development, but they weren't necessarily based, sometimes they had some insights, but they weren't necessarily based on, rigorous actual facts. And given the tools that those people had at the time, they really couldn't have been. There was just very limited data, no processing power to speak of. And then, for a while, kind of economists lost interest. They just said, well, we essentially, our tools aren't suited to look at this. We don't really know anything. And then over time, we've tried to add additional knowledge. And I'd say, we're still kind of at the point where most of the map is blank. I think there's a huge number of things about economic development that we don't understand. But slowly, a lot of people are working, very hard. I'm sure many of you as well, to kind of add in more details to our understanding of why countries grow and develop economically or don't over time. And so today I want to use some of my research to illustrate one thing in particular, which is the importance of understanding the channels or the mechanisms of persistence in economic development. We know by now that there's a lot of persistence, but why is that? What generates that? And so in particular, I think that one of the things that we learned, which kind of maybe makes sense ex ante, but we needed to kind of learn this with more rigorous evidence, is that you can have historical events or institutions that, at first glance, at least to an outside researcher kind of living hundreds of years later, we may think of them as being very similar, but actually they can have very different effects on economic development in the long run. And so, I think an anthropologist would, of course, say, well, of course, we knew that, and we can't generalize. Everything's local. Everything is specific. But in fact, I don't think that this means that we can't generalize, but rather, if you want to understand the long run effects of something that happens in the past, and you want to understand that in a general way, you need to focus on the transmission mechanisms, which are what is going to determine the effects in the long run. And so this suggests moving beyond an emphasis just on, what we would call in causal language, the treatment. So beyond saying, okay, it's about extractive institutions, and more towards an examination of which intervening variables matter, and why that's the case. And so I'm going to give an illustration of this with two different examples of extractive colonial institutions that are drawn from my work. The first example is the Peruvian mining mita, in which the Spanish for 240 years forced native peoples in Peru to work in the silver mines in Potosí. And the second example is the cultivation system in Java, through which the Dutch in the 19th century forced Javanese to produce sugar that the Dutch then sold on world markets. And this latter work is joint work with Ben Olken at MIT. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about the mining mita. This was instituted by the Spanish colonial government in 1573 and abolished in 1812. It required over 200 indigenous communities in Peru and Bolivia to send 1/7 of their adult male population to work in the Potosí silver mines. They also worked in mercury mines because you needed mercury to get the silver out of the rocks that it was trapped in. The Potosí mines were discovered in 1545, and they provided the largest deposits of silver in the Spanish Empire. So when you hear about the Spanish bringing all the silver back from the New World, a large share of that is coming from Potosí. And the mita assigned over 14,000 conscripts from Peru and Bolivia to the Potosí mines, and another several thousand to the Huancavelica mines to mine the mercury that they needed to refine the silver. And so this is a map showing the mita's extent. You can see that it covered much of what is today Peru and Bolivia, and you see Potosí there in the south and Huancavelica in the north. And I'm going to be focusing in particular on the part of that region highlighted in white. And the reason for that will become kind of apparent in a minute. And so I ask a couple of questions. Does the mita exert a long-run impact on development, which I'm going to measure with household consumption and also with things like children's height, which are a proxy for consumption, because many children in this region today remain malnourished. And if there is a long run effect on economic development, the question is why? Why would something that was abolished a couple hundred years ago still matter today? And I'm going to focus on a couple of channels of persistence, the impact that the mita had on land tenure, as well as on public goods. And to do that, I'm going to draw together data that comes from the 17th century through the present. So I'm going to trace, kind of as best as I can, given data limitations, the impacts that the mita had across time. Okay. And so this is a zoomed in map of the region that I'm going to be focusing on. And I'm going to be comparing across these green boundaries. The places inside the green area were forced to send 1/7 of their male population to work in the mines. And the places outside were exempt. I'm focusing on this area because pre-characteristics that we're able to measure, proxies for the prosperity of the place based on how many taxes they paid before the mita, the geography, look the same across these boundaries. Whereas the rest of the boundaries I showed you, it follows essentially the edge of the Andean range. And so when you cross the boundary, geography changes a lot, and so do other pre-characteristics. So I'm focusing in on this area. It appears, based on everything we can observe, that it was the same beforehand, but essentially the way they decided where to subject was they decided ex ante how many people they needed for the mines. The king of Spain made them go out and commission a survey that said we need X people, and then they used the census data to figure out the places to subject and just took the places that were the closest to the mines. And so if you're just barely like a kilometer or two inside this boundary, your community has to send people to work in the mines. Whereas if your community is outside the boundary, you don't. And you see that we can, precisely locate these boundaries. And if we look across them today, there are indeed differences, measurable differences in household consumption taken from a household living standards survey. And so the dots in this picture represent the raw data. The bigger the dot, the more people that were surveyed in that village. And the darker the color, the lower the consumption. And then the background is predicted values from a regression that includes polynomial in latitude and longitude to try to control for everything that changes smoothly. So of course, characteristics may be changing as you move from north to south or east to west or northwest to southeast. And by having this flexible polynomial in latitude and longitude, we can control for the things that change smoothly and just exploit the discontinuous change that happens as you move across this boundary from being an exempt village to a subjected village. And you can see that the household equivalent consumption drops discontinuously. Places that are inside this boundary are about 25% poorer today. You can look at children's heights. This is actually a census of children, so we get kind of more power than we would from the household consumption survey. And again, the darker the color, the higher the percentage of children that have stunted growth because they haven't gotten enough nutrition. And you can see that, again, as you move across this boundary into the villages that were subjected, children become substantially more likely to have stunted growth due to the fact that the subjected places are poorer and have worse nutrition. And so this shows that this forced labor during the colonial period, it still matters in a very concrete way for the people, for the children that are living in these places that used to be subjected to this forced labor. But then you might be thinking, well, why on earth would this still matter? It was abolished 200 years ago. That's a really long time. Don't we expect there to be convergence? Why is that not happening? And so that is the question that most of the paper tries to focus on. And in particular, through doing a bunch of reading in the historical literature, I settled on a land tenure as a major channel to focus on. And the reason for that is that the historical literature emphasizes that the mita had major effects on land tenure. And so the mita was instituted fairly early in Spanish colonial history, before many Spaniards had arrived to form a landed elite in the region. And there's a few reasons why we would expect the mita to impact land tenure. And so when landowners show up from Spain to settle this region, the state does not want to have competition for them for labor. In order for the king to make his money off of the silver, 20% of the silver was paid in tax to the king of Spain. He had to have people in the mines to work the mines. And because there was population collapse, if you'd had free labor, the wages would have just been too high for there to be any profit left over for the king. And so the government needed to be able to coerce these laborers to work in the mine. But if they had let landowners show up and start an estate, next to where the indigenous people were living who worked in the mines, of course, the landowner would have said, no, I'm not going to let you take my laborers to the mines. I need these laborers, to stay here and work in my fields, and would have probably responded violently. The state did not want to have that competition. And so they did not allow Spanish who showed up to settle the region to settle in the areas that were subjected to the mita. They would only grant them an estate in the areas that were exempt. Another reason for that is they paid the workers in the mines less than subsistence wages. And so if you let Spaniards come and take away their land, the state's going to have to somehow figure out how to feed them. Whereas if you let the people who work in the mines, let their communities keep their land, then they can feed themselves. Allowing them to keep their land also provided a means to compensate indigenous leaders who cooperated in administering the mita. The Spanish crown had very, very few people on the ground in Peru. The people who are working in the mines are being rounded up and taken to Potosi by indigenous leaders, and the Spaniards needed a way to co-opt those people and pay them off. And so in short, there were a lot of reasons why the crown did not let landowners, Spanish landowners, come into these areas that were subjected to the mita. And that in turn, because land ownership is such a persistent thing, even in the United States, there's work, say, by Hoyt Bleakley and Joe Ferry showing that land ownership patterns persist over 100 years. In an area like Peru, where there's not really very functional land markets, land ownership is just incredibly persistent. So you can abolish the mita, but actually the land ownership was very persistent. So in the non-mita districts, private ownership by a Hispanic elite predominated. When the Spanish showed up to settle in the 16th and 17th centuries, this was a period of massive population collapse for the indigenous population. And so they actually didn't face much resistance in seizing the land. It's very different than, say, colonialism in Asia later on, where you didn't have that same population collapse. The Europeans were really able to show up, grab the land. There were many indigenous people left alive to really to put up a strong resistance to that. And so the Spanish showed up, they settled in these non-mita districts, they had secure property rights and title. There wasn't much conflict over land. And these land tenure norms remained stable after the abolition of the mita. So they abolished the mita and Peru gained independence, but these people, these Spanish settlers still had their land titles, and those were stable and respected. Whereas in the mita districts, while the mita was in force during the colonial period, there was communal land tenure. But at independence, communal land tenure was abolished, but the Peruvian state did not replace that with any other norm of property rights. The people living in these mita areas just did not have any enforceable title or any title at all to their land. And so that led to a lot of instability. Spanish elites, Hispanic elites tried to come in and take the land, but by this time population had recovered. The indigenous population was able to put up a lot of resistance. And so you have essentially a lot of instability and fighting over land. And so this is showing you haciendas, which are large landed estates in 1689. And you see effectively inside the mita, there's like virtually zero haciendas. It's the dark blue. There's a couple of exceptions, but they really basically did not let Spanish people have land there. Whereas in the area outside, there are lots of estates. There's not data for the full region, but this is as much data as has been preserved. If you move forward to 1845, you see the effects start to, there's some changes. Some Spanish settlers do try to come in and get land, but they're not, fully successful. The indigenous people that are there resist that. And you can even go forward as far as 1940, and some Spanish elite have succeeded in seizing land in the former mita areas, but there's still a discontinuity there. There's still more likely to be haciendas as far forward as 1940. There's land reform after this. So today there actually are not differences in land distribution because there was a land reform. The landed elites largely left and their land was split up. But you potentially still have the lingering effects of this. And so, long after the abolition of the mita, the fact that the mita used to be there is still affecting who owns land and how much stability there is over land, which in turn is going to affect other downstream outcomes that matter for economic development, because this is an agricultural region and land is the foundation of the economy. So we can see education historically is lower in the mita areas. It's very, very low everywhere, actually. It's really only children of the landed elites that are getting education. We can come all the way forward to very recently, and what you see is that there are fewer roads in the mita areas. And the reason for this is that when the Peruvian government did most of the modern road building in the early 20th century, the hacienda owners, the owners of these large estates, lobbied for the roads to come to their estates because they wanted to take their produce to market. And, since things were stable, they also had higher returns to having those roads. And so the roads were built to go to the estates of these large landowners who were politically connected. And Peru has not built a massive number of new roads in the second half of the 20th century. And so where they put the roads initially, actually kind of matters a lot for where there are roads today. And well, if you don't have roads, and by and large in the mita areas, I mean, the roads, they're not paved, the roads that exist are in very bad condition. If you don't have roads, you can't take your produce to market. And so rates of market participation are much lower. I mean, if you look in the mita areas, in a lot of those villages, the vast number of people, this is from the agricultural census, the vast number of agricultural producers are growing for subsistence. They don't sell their produce in markets at all. And, I've been to these places and talked to people, and they'll say things like, well, yeah, I could grow more corn, but there's no point because I don't have a road to get it to the market in the nearest city. It would be destroyed, en route trying to carry it to the market. So why am I going to grow more corn than my family needs to eat? Because I don't have a way to get that to the market. And so because these places did not have as many landowners historically due to this persistent effect of the mita, they don't have access to roads today, and roads are a really important part of economic development. And so this provides kind of a link to what happened hundreds of years ago and to what life looks like for these people today in a way that's perhaps, not the stereotype, the traditional literature would have said extractive institutions are bad because, then the government doesn't protect your property rights and they steal things. And that was certainly true historically in the mita areas. They didn't protect property rights, but really, in the long run, it also has to do with things like, the road infrastructure, which ends up being very persistent. And so, in short, my hypothesis is that the long-term presence of large landowners in non-mita districts provided a stable land tenure system that encouraged public goods provision. In the literature on Latin America, you'll often see the hypothesis that Latin America is poor relative to the US because of these large landowners. But actually, if you take the large landowners away, this research suggests that at least in Peru, the alternative to large landowners was not like Massachusetts. It was not, small and franchise landowners, because the institutional structures in place did not respect the rights of the people, the indigenous people that held the vast majority of the land in mita districts. Rather, if you hadn't had any Spanish landowners, what you got instead was just the state exploiting people initially, and then subsequently poorly defined property rights and the under provision of public goods. And so certainly these exempt districts were not organized for the benefit of the masses. And of course, today they're still much poorer, than the developed world. They're still kind of very poor by OECD standards, but relative to the places where there was kind of exploitation by the state, they're actually doing better. And the evidence suggests that that's because these large landowners did actually serve as a stabilizing force. And they did provide some public goods that actually persisted after the landowners were removed. And the populace today, kind of, now that the landowners are gone, does derive some benefits from those. Okay, so now I want to give an alternative example of extractive institutions, which is the cultivation system in Java. And so, as we've seen in this study, and there's a whole much broader literature, of course, starting with the famous work by Asimoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, extractive colonizers, plausibly set up weak institutions. Those could have led to poor property right protections and lower long-run development. However, if you go and you read the history of different extractive colonial institutions, you kind of quickly get the sense from historians that while the goal was always, the extraction of resources by the colonizer, and while these kind of systems were always undoubtedly horrible for the people that were exploited by them at the time, they created a very different kind of set of economic institutions that could potentially have different sorts of effects for long-run development. And there's some examples where colonial powers wanted to extract something, and in order to extract that surplus, they actually needed to establish these complex economic systems that could have had a counteracting kind of positive effect on long-run development. And so with Ben Olken, we look at this in the context of the Dutch cultivation system in Java. And so the island of Java was the center of the Dutch colonial empire. It has a modern population of over 160 million people. From the early 1830s through the 1870s, the Dutch colonial state forced peasants along Java's northern coast to cultivate sugar, which was then processed in nearby colonial sugar factories for export to Europe. The revenues at the peak of this system accounted for 1/3 of Dutch government revenue and 5% of GDP. And so if you look at the revenues generated from the system, it's actually the largest example of colonial exploitation in history. And so it's not some obscure example. It's really central to the history of exploitation by colonial powers. Sugar production later collapsed during the Great Depression, and Indonesia is now the world's largest sugar importer. And so, these places that were exploited to produce sugar historically, they don't by and large produce sugar anymore. And so in order to extract the sugar, the Dutch needed to establish 94 water-powered sugar processing factories that made use of, at the time, very modern technology. And because raw cane is very heavy to transport, the cane had to be grown nearby. And so the Dutch created a catchment area with a radius of approximately 5 kilometers around each of these factories that they built, which were water-powered, so all along rivers. And they forced all villages in the catchment area to reorganize their land to grow cane. And, again, the Dutch didn't have many actual Dutch officials on the ground in rural Java. And so this was largely organized by local officials who were empowered and given financial incentives by the Dutch to make this happen. And so reports from the 1860s show that over 2.5 million workers labored in the sugar factories or related services, and they were joined by free laborers across, then that expanded over time. And so there's two distinct types of impacts that this could have had on the local development in these places. There's the effects of creating the sugar manufacturing infrastructure by building the factories, and the effects of subjecting villages to forced cultivation of sugar cane. And in principle, those long-run effects could be very different. Okay. And so how are we going to causally estimate the impacts of this? We exploit the fact that the places that grew sugar were typically adjacent to each other. They're all kind of in the coastal plain of Java. It's a very geographically homogeneous place, very flat, similar soil, similar climate. You have places, they're all nearby, kind of growing sugar. And the fact that they tend to be adjacent to each other means that there's many different equilibria for site selection. And so if you take one factory that you placed and you move it 2 kilometers upstream, you have to shift the factory next to that 2 kilometers upstream, because otherwise the factory that you moved can't maintain its minimal production size required for the factory to operate. And then you have to shift the factory downstream from that, another 2 kilometers, and so on and so forth. You really have to shift the entire set of factories over so that they can all maintain the minimum amount of land they need to meet their minimum production capacity. Same thing if you shifted 2 kilometers upstream or 5 kilometers upstream, you have to shift everything else. And so this means there's many, many different equilibria for site selection. And we estimate the effects of being close to an actual factory using highly disaggregated data, looking at villages that are 1 kilometer away, 2 kilometers away, 3 kilometers away. And we compare these effects to the distribution of estimated effects of being near plausible counterfactual factory sites. And so we essentially randomly move all the factories a little bit, and so that they're in an equilibrium where they all have space to meet their minimum production capacity, but they've all been shifted a bit. This shifts the places that are nearby, and we can use that as a counterfactual. And we're going to use GIS to identify counterfactual sites using 2 criteria. They must be along the same river as actual factories, and they have to have sufficient nearby land to grow sugarcane. And so I'm going to show an example. And so this is a map of an area of the Javanese coast. And the blue is areas suitable for sugar. The red is not suitable. You see rivers there. And the green dot is a factory. It's along a river because it has to be, it's water powered. And then there's a 5 kilometer radius around it, which is the approximate radius that a factory needs to meet its capacity. Now we could potentially shift that factory a few kilometers upstream, and you can see that there is now still enough sugar suitable land around that to meet the factory capacity. And in fact, there's many different places where you could shift it, a few kilometers upstream or downstream, and it would be able to meet its capacity. And so this is essentially what we're doing, but rather than shift one factory at a time, we're shifting all 94 factories around at a time, and you can't put any of them too close together because then they won't be able to meet their capacity. And this gives us all the counterfactual places that, again, this is a very geographically homogeneous region. They could have located factories there, but they just didn't because it would be too close to other factories. But if you shift everything at once, you can find these counterfactual arrangements, and you can find thousands of them and have distributions of counterfactual effects. Okay, so that's how we look at the impacts of being near this infrastructure, factory infrastructure that the Dutch constructed. We also want to look at the impacts of your village being forced to cultivate cane. And so to do that, we match villages, and there's over 10,000 of them. We have handwritten records of, the 10,000 villages that contributed to the system. We match them all with modern georeferenced sub-village locations to construct the precise boundaries, and in turn combine these with highly disaggregated outcome data. And we're going to do much like we did in the mita study, just a spatial comparison across the boundaries of the catchment area. Compare places just barely inside to places just barely outside. And because Java is so densely populated, there's like tens and tens of millions of people living within a few kilometers of these catchment area boundaries. And this allows us to control for smooth variation, including we're able to control for the distance to the nearest historical factory. And so the places are both, kind of similarly near the factory, but one had to contribute its land for forced cultivation and the other did not. And so these are all the different boundaries of the different catchment areas. The black dots are the factories, and then the areas around them had to contribute, and we're dividing the boundaries of those catchment areas into short segments, and we're only going to compare places near the same segment, just barely on either side of the boundary, kind of just like in the mita example that I showed you a few minutes ago. Okay, so just to summarize the results, first of all, for the impacts of sugar factories, people living within a few kilometers of historical sugar factories today are much less likely to be employed in agriculture and more likely to be employed in manufacturing. That's true in 1980, which is the earliest date we can see manufacturing, and it's true more recently. And in particular, in the immediate vicinity of the historical factories, there is more employment in industries downstream from sugar processing, even when we exclude the few places where there are modern sugar factories. So by and large, the sugar disappeared like in the 1930s. But these places that were close to where a sugar factory built by the Dutch used to be still specialize in manufacturing things that are downstream from sugar today. And so that's largely like food processing. You use sugar in all different types of foods. In close proximity to the historical factories, there's also more infrastructure, roads, electricity, and schools. And so historically, the Dutch had to build roads and railroads to the sugar factories to take the sugar to the ports so they could sell it on world export markets. And if you look at where there's roads and rail today in Java, it's basically the places where the Dutch built roads initially. As we might expect, household, given that these places have more manufacturing and better infrastructure, household consumption is also higher. And so I'm going to show you some of these results. And so this is looking at the share of people working in agriculture. And each of these dots is for a bin in distance to the nearest historical factory. And the omitted bin is 20 kilometers. And so people living 1 kilometer away from the historical factory are much less agricultural than people living 20 kilometers away. And we've differenced out the effects of being close to a counterfactual factory. And so if you shift things a couple of kilometers, upstream, there's no effects of being close to that counterfactual factory. Those differences are essentially zero, they're flat. But when you look near the actual factory, around where there used to be this historical sugar factory built by the Dutch, these places are less agricultural, substantially 20 to 30% less agricultural in 1980. And today, relative to places further away, but those effects fade out after a few kilometers. It's really in the few kilometers immediately surrounding the factory that these places are less agricultural, but that actually affects a lot of people given how densely populated Java is. The converse of that is that they have more manufacturing. The places around these historical factories are the manufacturing centers of this region today. And that's also true in 1980. If you look at modern sugar processing, if you include everywhere, yes, there's a few places that still have a modern sugar factory in the same place as the historical sugar factory, which you see in the top left. But in all of our analyses, we drop those few places where there's a modern sugar factory because that's kind of like mechanical. We don't want that to drive things. And so if you drop the few places with a modern sugar factory, then yes, obviously the value of sugar processed is no different when you move away from the factories. Nowhere are they growing raw cane near the factories. There's been improvements in transport technology and you don't need to do that anymore. Okay, so if you look at employment share upstream from sugar processing, which would be like agricultural machinery and capital machinery for the factory, yes, in the places that still have a modern sugar factory where the historical one was, you see more employment upstream, but you no longer see that once you drop the places that have modern factories. So they're only making the kind of factory machinery nearby when there's actually a modern sugar factory there. However, when you look at the employment share in downstream industry, so this is any industry that uses sugar as an input, even in the places where there's no modern factories, the sugar factories disappeared decades and decades ago, they still have far more industry that's downstream from sugar, where that historical sugar factory used to be before the Great Depression. And along with this, and now this entire sample is dropping the places with the modern sugar factories. Historically, going back to 1900, they have higher road density and higher railroad density. This is kind of a well-known fact in the historical literature. There were 94 of these factories, and the Dutch needed to build roads and railroads to all of them to get the sugar to the ports so that they could export it back to Europe. And if you look at road density today, inner city or local, basically where the roads were historically, that's where the roads are today. And so these places that got the historical sugar factory, they have better infrastructure today. They're less likely to only be accessible by a dirt road. They also still have better railroad infrastructure. And then we also see that they have better schooling infrastructure. So this is high schools in 1980 and today. And we can look in the 2000 census, we have 100% sample. This is millions and millions of people. We can look across different cohorts. So the cohort born 1920 to 29, that dark line, they were educated during the Dutch period. Then we have a cohort born 50 to 54, educated right after independence. And finally, a cohort born 70 to 74, educated once Indonesia really expanded their schooling system. And across all these different cohorts, people that are living in the immediate vicinity of these factories have higher schooling. And not surprisingly, they also they're about 10% richer today. Kind of what we would expect given that they have more manufacturing, better infrastructure. It's kind of almost exactly the effects you would expect from the returns to education as well. Okay, so that's the effects of having this sugar factory that, being close to where the Dutch built this kind of modern factory infrastructure. But what about the effects of being, forced to cultivate sugar? And again, we're going to see effects that are very different than in the case of the mita. And so again, though, it turns out that land seems to be a really important channel of persistence, because like the mita, the cultivation system had a major impact on land tenure. So in the subjected villages, the Dutch had land redistributed towards the village to grow the sugar on. And so the sugar was grown on this village-owned land. And actually, after you abolish the cultivation system all the way through to today, the village still owns more of that land than they own land in the places that were not subjected to the system. And so there's a very large impact on village-owned land. That village-owned land is used to pay public servants in the village, so like the village head and other village employees. And what we see is that education is modestly higher in subjected villages. And that's again true all the way when you go back to cohorts that were educated before and after independence. And there's actually historical books that talk about how, you know, the Dutch did not provide schooling for Indonesian people. In the colonial period, if you wanted to have a school, it had to be funded by the village, and it could be funded out of this land. So actually, interestingly, after the system was abolished, if you were really cynical, you might say, well, they probably just kind of used this land for the purposes of corruption. The village head could just steal all the money, but actually, no, they seem to have, you know, once that land was no longer being used by the Dutch for colonial exploitation, the villages still held it and used it to provide kind of at least some public goods, and especially education. A greater percentage of households work in manufacturing and retail and fewer in agriculture. Okay. When we look at differences in consumption, we don't see statistically significant differences, but given that the difference in a year of education is only about 1/10 of the year, so these effects are not huge. They're a lot smaller than the effects of being near a factory. The differences in consumption are not statistically significant, but it's a little bit higher, you know, on average, about what you would expect from having 1/10 of a year more schooling. And so our interpretation, you know, of these two sets of results together is that if you go back to 1830, rural Java was heavily agricultural. It was governed by feudal-like labor norms. And so there were large Javanese landholders, and they had attached peasants who were first forced to work on their land. This was not really an area that at this time, at least, was conducive to kind of modern economic development. But the Dutch knew that they could exploit more if they brought in kind of modern economic production. So they essentially came in, you know, and they built these modern factories, you know, they forced people to work in them. And this was no doubt kind of like horrible for the people who were forced to work in the factories. But if you move forward to today and you want to understand, well, why is this part of Indonesia richer or poorer than this other part? You know, it actually seems that this system of forest sugar cultivation brought modern manufacturing infrastructure. It brought downstream industries. Part of the reason for that is that, you know, the Dutch took all the good sugar, but the low quality sugar that was just, it would spoil before it got to Europe. The Javanese got to keep that. And so they built these industries downstream from sugar around the sugar factories, and those persisted like long after the exploitation had been removed. And we see kind of effects both near the historical factories and in subjected villages. You know, so clearly we're not looking at the impact of colonialism more generally. We don't have any idea what would happen if the Dutch had never showed up in Indonesia at all, and there's no real way to answer that question. If you look kind of specifically at the places that were more and less subjected to this system of colonial exploitation, actually in the long run, it seems to have spurred some economic changes that are beneficial from the standpoint of consumption today. And the Dutch were not unique in forcing major economic changes in their colonies in an effort to maximize revenue extraction. You know, so actually I digitized a ton of data from Taiwan, which along with Indonesia was the world's major sugar producer. The Taiwanese were forced to produce sugar by their Japanese colonizers. And you actually see very similar results. But the problem with Taiwan is that when the Japanese showed up, they spent like 5 years conducting these very precise surveys, and they found exactly the places that had the most population and were the most productive, and that's where they put their sugar factories. And so there's no way to causally identify the effect of the Japanese sugar production in Taiwan, whereas in Indonesia, the Dutch didn't do any of these surveys. They just kind of showed up and put factories in places that really appear to be random. So we're more able to kind of identify effects. And so, these economic changes, they were no doubt kind of very negative for the people who were forced to work in these sugar fields. But they also ushered in these economic changes, which had a persistent influence on the development trajectory through the construction of infrastructure that was persistent, through input-output linkages, which are also super persistent. You remove the sugar production, but those downstream industries stay located there through agglomeration and through human capital accumulation. And so why did the Dutch sugar system lead to actually these positive long-run outcomes in the places that were subjected relative to the places that weren't, in contrast to the mita or to other well-studied examples, like this paper by Loza and Montero on forced rubber cultivation in the Congo. And so in particular, we see that two factors are important: the role of manufacturing and investments in infrastructure. And so the cultivation system required substantial and at the time very sophisticated local manufacturing in order to process sugar cane. Raw sugar cane is heavy, it's full of water, it spoils quickly, you can't transport it very far at all. And so you had to build the manufacturing infrastructure locally. Whereas with the mita, conscripts were marched from their communities to a single location up to 1,000 kilometers away in Potosi to mine raw silver. And then you just carried the raw silver down to the coast and you exported it. There did not need to be hardly any infrastructure construction for the mita, whereas for the cultivation system, you had to have this manufacturing infrastructure, and the mita just didn't have that. Congolese rubber, kind of like the mita, you just needed to cut it into cubes and dry it in the sun before exporting it to Europe. There's no local manufacturing along with that. And these linkages between sugar and other sectors plausibly provide a key mechanism for this persistence, for the propagation of industrialization over time. Once you have the linked industries there, that is very persistent even when the original industry disappears. Infrastructure investments are also super important. You had 94 sugar factories. You needed to build roads and rail to all of them, which was resulted in very dense infrastructure, which is still kind of the main infrastructure and job of the day. So this is very reminiscent of the findings of Dave Donaldson and his Railroad of the Raj paper in India, where he looks at the long-run impacts of this railroad infrastructure, or at the more immediate impacts of the railroad infrastructure. In the Peruvian case, the infrastructure was actually built later on and outside the mita areas. You didn't need road infrastructure for the mita, but it affected settlement, in a way that channel is totally gone in Indonesia. Dutch people, by and large, did not settle in rural Java. It just didn't happen. Whereas in Peru, the Spanish people settled there, and where they settled was the places that got all the public goods later on. And that's really important to the persistence. So they both influence infrastructure, because infrastructure just by definition is persistent. So infrastructure is a really good place to look if you're trying to understand persistence. But these two cases just, for these various reasons, had very different impacts on infrastructure. Again, if you look at the case of the Congo, the Belgians just had the strong incentives to maximize short-run extraction before rubber took off elsewhere. They just wanted to get as much as they could out as fast as they could using extremely coercive practices, and they didn't need to invest in infrastructure. They just put the rubber on a boat and floated it down the river. Okay. And so now in the final kind of 5 minutes, I want to say a few words about future directions. And so I think that there's more or less widespread consensus that understanding mechanisms of persistence is important, but the literature still largely focuses on historical forces that still influence development today. And the treatment of richer dynamics of persistence and transformation is much more limited. If you look, as somebody who's like a hoarder of historical data, there is just kind of enormous persistence in development. The places that were underdeveloped a long time ago, even looking within a narrow geographic region, tend to be the places that are sort of less developed today. But of course, there's important examples of richer dynamics, and I think we don't really have a great understanding of those. So just some big open questions. What factors promote takeoff? I mean, people have thought about this in the context of like England and the Industrial Revolution, but outside Europe, there's very little literature on takeoff, despite, examples like the East Asian growth miracle, which are some of the most remarkable instances of economic growth in history, but we don't have much understanding of those. Even though there's data that you could use to look at, people haven't really done that. What forces lead to convergence versus to like leapfrogging, where places jump ahead more discontinuously? What about stagnation, reversal? What are the micro foundations of persistence dynamics? And how do historical forces interact with modern reforms? All of these questions would give us a richer sense of the dynamics of persistence, not just about something historically that matters today, and not even just about why, but what did those richer dynamics look like? And what about the cases where there's not persistence? Why is that the case? And I think that we have a new set of tools that is going to allow us to make a lot more progress over the coming decade on these questions than we've been able to make in the past. And so in particular, I think part of the reason why we don't have a very rich understanding of the dynamics of persistence is that if you want to study dynamics, you need lots of data. You need pretty rich data. Microeconomic data helps you a lot in studying dynamics, because if you just have kind of more aggregated data, you're just never going to be powered enough to understand dynamics. But the challenge of doing that, and especially if you want to go outside the US and Europe, is that the vast majority of historical data is in hard copy. And, in fact, there are many contexts where there's incredibly rich historical data, but it would just be vastly too costly to digitize by hand. And so actually new methods in deep learning can allow us to automate the digitization of these complex historical data sources. And that just unlocks a lot of data that we can use to study kind of richer patterns of persistence and transformation that you can never get at with what tends to be kind of the more aggregated data that people are able to digitize by hand. Just going beyond the traditional context. Like the US is actually pretty remarkable in being a country that tended to grow at 2% per year every year for hundreds of years. That's not what growth looks like. That's not what persistence looks like in most of the world. And so just the fact that economics is a much more diverse field today than it was historically. We have a much more diverse set of scholars who are familiar with more context, and that's going to really enrich what we're able to understand. And then just greater synergies with other frontiers in social science. You might think there's literature on networks, behavioral economics, all of these things might also be relevant. So I just in particular want to say a quick word about methods for unlocking data. Many key questions require disaggregated data. It oftentimes does exist, but it's trapped in hard copy unless it's like, the US Census that's been digitized by Ancestry.com. Like for the vast majority of countries, this data is not digitized. It's just vastly too large and costly to digitize by hand. Also, important data can come from non-traditional sources. It could come from text. It could come from aerial photographs, from satellites. And because I think that having this data is so key to being able to say something about the richer patterns of development. I've spent most of the past couple of years working on developing deep learning methods to automate the processing of economic data at scale. And so that both includes digitizing, complex historical documents like historical firm records or tables, and also tools like natural language processing to be able to extract data that's trapped in text. And in particular, if I just wanted to do this for my own research, it would take a lot less time, but I don't write many papers. I can't study many things. I wanted to make these tools kind of available to the profession. And we've released an open source Python package called Layout Parser that substantially lowers the barriers to performing a full document image analysis using deep learning. So it's not just about OCRing the content, but about taking a raw document, could be a very complex table, and automatically extracting the structured database that you would need to do quantitative analysis. And so this is like the website, you can go check it out. The goal is to allow you to build a full pipeline so that you can start with a raw document and recognize the different types of information that's present in that document, automatically classify those and digitize those so that the end output is actually a structured database that you can use for your papers. I also include a link to a knowledge base on my website that gives some background and a bunch of resources for actually understanding the deep learning methods that underlie the tools in this package. Okay, so just to conclude, I've argued that understanding history is important for elucidating processes of persistence and change in economic development. The literature to date has mostly focused on, first of all, showing that history matters and providing some insights into why. But moving forward, I think innovations in various areas, deep learning in particular, but also things like regional studies, economics of networks, has the potential to unlock significant new insights into much richer patterns of persistence and transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. This was a fascinating talk, and questions have been coming. I'm seeing the last 15, 20 minutes, the chat is filling up. I will not stand in the way. I want to just toss in one question or other thought, and then I'm going to go quiet and you will get the questions from the chat. See, it is fascinating. I mean, what can come out of history if you look at it carefully, if you have the data and the ability to pass the data, which leaves me with a question about policy intuition that comes out of it. It actually a somewhat paradoxical thought that since there are such surprising findings, what happens in the colonial rule in Peru turns out to be very different from what happens in Java, and who knows, could be very different in Congo. Does that also mean that policymaking is a hopeless exercise? Because there are these surprising results. Some we have found, some we haven't, and in the long run, you don't know. I just want your thoughts. And I personally, in fact, though I've spent time in policymaking, I don't think everything in life has to lead to policy prescription. Understanding is very, very important. But this connection between the surprise and understanding when you look at history, does that make you agnostic about the hope for guessing what the future will be based on policy? Some thoughts on that, and then I'll let others come in with questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to having kind of the right model of why things matter. So for example, something that emerges from the papers I presented, but also kind of from the literature more broadly, is that infrastructure seems to be very persistently important for economic development. Of course, this is a huge policy issue. It's a major debate in the US now, but kind of also more broadly, right? And it shows kind of the importance of these infrastructure developments, but also maybe thinking about kind of why the infrastructure is the way it is that create these kind of persistent inequalities that are important for understanding kind of inequalities in development more generally. I think another policy insight that comes from this is it's sort of suggestive about the importance of industrial policy, which is a whole huge can of worms, because we know we have many examples of industrial policy gone wrong, but it also seems like in some of these cases where development has happened, it wasn't totally organic. There was this investment by the state that came in. It was very disruptive. They created these factories, but then that kind of kickstarted this process of industrial development. And again, we see that, speaking of East Asia, it seems to be important. So we know that it's not like a simple prescription because it can be done incorrectly, but it seems like a promising area to focus. And so I think that you do see these regularities emerge, but you have to be very humble about it because the world is very complex. And in some sense, our models are just incredibly underdetermined. So I don't think we should throw up our hands and say, everything's local and we can't make any conclusions at all. But I think it's also, it's an argument for, maybe doing things in a way that's smaller that you can measure. Like if you think about James Scott and his work on legibility and how these massive social engineering projects where governments tried to change a bunch of things at the same time tended to fail because they just can't understand kind of the complex systems. I think, there's an argument for us kind of being humble in our policy recommendations, which I know it's sometimes hard to get policymakers and the public to listen to you if you're like that, but the reality is that the world's pretty complex. And so I think you do have to proceed with some caution.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I probably am going to go completely quiet, so thanks a lot for this wonderful lecture. Uday, will you take over?
I will take over with some of the questions that I will pose to Melissa at this hour. There are plenty of questions that have come. So they are mainly related to data collection. So one question is the various methods of historical data collection, how that is being done. And second is, what happens if some of the data in some time period is missing, then how you are going to measure the persistence and whether that is creating any challenge. Okay, so these are related to, another question is related to the institutional interaction in the context of the different changes that you see in Indonesia related to the change of cultivation. Okay, so these are the three questions. Let me just have your reactions on this, and then I will read out some more with more pointed question. Okay, so these are some of the questions actually.
Yep. So I think in terms of data collection, as I mentioned, I think especially when you want to kind of step outside the traditional context and do something in a historical context that's outside kind of the context where the field has predominantly worked and created data, which again is kind of mostly US and Europe oriented, then you do have substantially higher barriers in data curation. So first of all, you need to find the data, which can be a major challenge in itself, especially in these times of COVID where everything is closed. But you need to, and that may be a combination of, there are some contexts that have pretty thorough kind of online libraries and digitization schemes. There's other contexts where it's all just sitting in hard copy in a library somewhere or in an archive. And I do think that kind of persistence is and that is important. And then once you find the data, that you need to digitize it. So I talk a ton about this. If you go to kind of the knowledge base on my website, I'd recommend that. It's not something I can, give a deep delve into and then, a short Q&A session. But I do think, manual digitization has its place, but it's still, it's very costly. There'll be errors. You need to go back and check everything. It's in my view, it's worth really making some investments in the technical expertise that you need to be able to automate things. And I think it makes life easier in the long run, even though it's a lot of work. And kind of my goal is to put the resources out there to direct people in the right direction so you have some idea of where to start. In terms of missing data, this is a huge issue. And I think there's lots of questions that we'd like to look at and just can't, because if the data doesn't exist, well, what can you say? But fortunately, there's many, many unanswered questions. And so there's also many important questions that we have data for. I think data black holes can be kind of systematic. So oftentimes in the years following independence of a country, data is particularly bad, right? And sometimes those are really interesting periods. You'd like to look at them, but if nobody was collecting data, that's a problem. I think also it goes back to expanding our notion of what data is, which is again where I kind of direct towards the methods. And so, for example, thinking about aerial photographs, right? The CIA in the US took millions and millions and millions of aerial photographs during the Cold War. And those could in theory be used to extract information about economic development, much like people do with satellite images today. They're very high resolution. in places where there's no economic survey data. But in order to do that, you need computer vision tools. And so understanding deep learning-based computer vision methods is actually really powerful. Or there might be information trapped in text. Basically, I think the better your tools are for processing data, the more expansive your view of what data is can be. And that opens a lot of interesting windows. And then finally, on the question of like, institutional effects in the cultivation system, so we looked, the focus of the paper is on local development. We're comparing these places to these places over here. We have no way to say how the cultivation system affected national institutions, and it may have done that because there's just one cultivation system and just one Indonesian government. And if you compare it to a country like Malaysia or something, they're totally different in a billion ways. So we don't really have a way to say how the cultivation system may have affected national institutions. If you look at like the village level political outcomes, voting, my co-author collected a bunch of data on corruption, on how people make decisions about redistribution. He basically has a huge amount of data on the political economy of Indonesia. You just don't really see effects. And so, for whatever reason, it doesn't actually seem to have effects, at least that we're able to measure, on kind of political economy at a local level. That's not to say that it couldn't have had some effect at a more aggregate level that we have no way to causally estimate.
So another question is from the Ulapre Balakrishnan about, would you draw out the connection between property rights and public goods provision? You use this idea in the context of the mita.
I didn't quite understand the question.
So should I repeat it? So would you draw out the connection between property rights and public goods provision?
Yep. And so I think that there's several mechanisms that are potentially important here. And so first of all, just the people that own property tend to be more politically connected. And so they're able to lobby for public goods. Also like landowners had to put up kind of a contribution to them. And if you have stable property rights, there's a higher return to having public goods. Also, the people in the places with unstable property rights actually oftentimes didn't want the public goods, like public infrastructure goods, because it makes it easier to steal their land. And so there's all these examples where the government tried to build a railroad into the mita areas that would take, there's a lot of sheep there. And with the Industrial Revolution, wool became a very desired commodity for producing clothing. And so they wanted to build a railroad to these mita areas in the late 19th century to export the wool. And actually the people, the indigenous people that lived there, kept on destroying the railroad because they understood that the railroad would increase the economic value of their land. And since their land was not secure, they did not want that to happen because they knew that that return would be captured by somebody who can now come in and take their land. And so I think you have kind of all those things at play. If you don't have secure property rights and infrastructure actually makes your land a lot more valuable, you might not want it. And whereas if you had secure property rights, you clearly would.
Another question is from one of our students, Garima Agarwal. She wrote, how should you begin to think about a counterfactual without colonization? I'm wondering if in that scenario, the areas with factories which seem to be better off in the future would have been even more developed. Also, how are the extractive effects on control areas assessed? This is from Garima Agarwal. You can also find that in the box.
Yeah, so, first of all, I don't think you really can quantitatively say what the effect would have been without colonization, because it's just the places that weren't colonized were not colonized precisely for reasons that we have a ton of other evidence affects long run development. And so, certainly people try to do this, But I really think that that the world's just too underdetermined. We don't have enough countries, like the countries that weren't colonized, they're just too different. And so, for example, the Dutch, the VOC, they show up in Japan, and Japan has a very kind of strong centralized state, and the Japanese government says you may, trade once a year here, and that's it. Otherwise, get out. And they had an army, and they were able, a navy, and they're able to enforce that. And the Dutch left because, there was a strong state. And we know precisely there's plenty of other evidence that like having a strong historical state matters for development today. Whereas when the Dutch show up in Indonesia, there's kind of this much weaker state that's trying to take over these areas along the north coast, where there's kind of these almost like feudal lords, and they're fighting with each other. And the feudal lords actually, like, you read the correspondence and they beg the Dutch, they say, we want to be your vassal because we hate this other guy over here who's trying to subject us. And you see this from like the modern perspective and you think, don't do that. But like, to them at the time, it's just some other powerful guy that's showing up that can help them to kind of beat up on the traditional guy who's trying to collect taxes from them that they hate, and is a very weak kind of decentralized state. And that's why the Dutch could take over, but that matters a lot for long run development. Like, and we know that, like, and so I just feel like you can speculate. There's a paper by James Robinson and Leander Heldrian that speculates on colonialism in Africa. And they say, well, it depends on the location. There were some places that were doing pretty well before the colonizers showed up, and we think they would have actually been better off. And then there's other places that were just, not doing well at all. They're super remote, no sign of development. Maybe they were actually helped by some of this infrastructure, but I mean, it's a speculative exercise. And in some sense, it's hopefully purely like an intellectual exercise, in that, like, from a policy perspective, hopefully nobody wants to kind of reinstitute colonization. That it's fascinating to think about, but I think it's going to kind of remain in the realm of speculation because there's just not very much variation.
Okay, thank you very much, Melissa, for delivering a wonderful lecture. I'm sure your lecture will stimulate many in the audience to undertake research on the historical processes of development. I'm also grateful to Professor Basu for going way beyond the call of duty to support all endeavors at the Delhi School and the IER. You would be happy to know that in addition to the attendees in this Zoom meeting, about 150 people watched the event on YouTube live stream. A thanks to the audience for their patience and understanding in the way the logistics of this talk have been handled. I'm grateful to my editorial team members, Abhijit Banerjee, JV Meenakshi, and Srikant Gupta for all the support in organizing this event. Thanks are also due to a team of volunteers, Disha, Vistuti, Somendu, Winston, Neeraj, Anjali, Mukta, and Renu for managing the logistics. I should also mention here Raju and Sanveer from the IT team at the Center for Development Economics for backend support. Finally, we want to let you know that the entire recording of today's talk will be available on our webpage and also on YouTube for a limited period of time. Thank you all. Thank you
so much.